Hi, I'm Jenna Matthews, and I never imagined my father's funeral would turn into the most humiliating moment of my life. My brother insulted me in front of everyone, and before I could even make sense of it, he pulled me aside and said something even worse, something that made my stomach drop. At first, I thought it was just grief talking, until I realized he'd been planning this for a long time. And when I finally took everything to a lawyer, what she uncovered changed everything I thought I knew about my own family. I stood in the back corner of the funeral home, watching people I barely recognized anymore file past Dad's casket. The mahogany gleamed under those awful fluorescent lights, and I kept thinking about how he would have hated the whole production. Dad was simple, quiet. He would have wanted something small, maybe just me and David. But David had other ideas about everything, including this moment that was supposed to be about grief. My brother worked the room like a politician, shaking hands and accepting condolences while his wife Rachel smiled that practiced church function smile. I watched him lean into conversations, voice carrying that authoritative tone he'd developed since Dad got sick. People nodded at whatever he was saying, faces full of sympathy. Mrs. Henderson from next door squeezed my hand, mentioning how proud Dad must have been of my sacrifices. David appeared beside us so quickly I wondered if he'd been watching. His face was tight with something cold. Jenna's always been good at playing the martyr, but she was pretty useless when Dad actually needed help. The words cut through conversations like a knife. Mrs. Henderson's eyes widened. I felt my cheeks burn as people turned to stare. My mouth opened, but nothing came out. I escaped to the bathroom, hands shaking as I gripped the sink. 20 minutes later, most people had left. David found me gathering my purse and pulled me into the small viewing room. The overwhelming smell of lilies made me sick. He closed the door, and his whole demeanor shifted into something I'd never seen before. Something calculated. "We need to talk about the house," he said. No apology for the public humiliation. "Dad's house. I know you think you have some claim because you live there, but that's not how inheritance works." His voice was matter-of-fact, like explaining something obvious to a child. My stomach dropped. This wasn't grief. This was planned. This conversation had been rehearsed. I reminded him about the mortgage payments, the medical bills, 3 years of carrying everything while he visited once a month. My voice cracked, and I hated how small I sounded. David nodded like he was humoring me. "You were living there rent-free. Consider it even." He straightened his tie, checking his watch. "As the eldest with a stable family, I inherit the property. It's in the will." "You haven't seen the will yet," I whispered. David's smile wasn't kind. "Actually, Dad showed it to me last year during one of your teaching conferences." My knees felt weak. All those nights sitting beside Dad's bed, and he'd never mentioned this to me. David continued. "He wanted me to understand my responsibilities as executor." The word responsibilities hit like a slap. The drive home felt endless. I kept replaying every conversation with Dad, searching for signs I'd missed. Had he really seen me as just temporary help? The house where I'd moved back to care for him, where I'd planned to build something meaningful, suddenly felt foreign. I pulled into the driveway and sat staring at the front door I'd repainted last spring. Inside, everything looked the same but felt different. The silence was heavier, loaded with questions. I walked through rooms where we'd watched old movies together, where he'd told stories about Mom. My laptop sat open on the kitchen table, still logged into his banking. 3 years of my financial records stacked neatly in folders I'd organized. That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in Dad's chair surrounded by paperwork I'd never examined closely. Bank statements, mortgage documents, medical bills, all handled in my name for 3 years. Dad had seemed so grateful, had told me repeatedly how much my help meant. But maybe David was right. Maybe I'd just been filling in until the real inheritor could take over. The next morning, I called my friend Lisa, a paralegal. "Bring everything," she said when I explained. "Wills can be complicated, and there might be things about your legal position you don't understand." Her voice was gentle but serious. "Don't let anyone pressure you." I gathered every document I could find, my hands finally steady. Attorney Rebecca Walsh looked like someone who didn't suffer fools. She listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes. When I finished, she leaned back. First, we see this will. Second, we review your contributions. Third, I want the timeline of these arrangements. She paused, studying my face. How well did you really know your father's financial situation? The question caught me off guard. I thought I knew everything about Dad's finances since I'd been managing them. But Attorney Walsh was looking at me like pieces were missing. When did you first start making mortgage payments? I explained the conversation 3 years ago. How Dad seemed overwhelmed after his heart attack. How he'd asked for temporary help. And it never became untemporary? She asked gently. I shook my head. Dad's health declined steadily, and I'd never questioned the arrangement. Taking care of family felt natural. Attorney Walsh made more notes. I need authorization to request records from the bank and county. There might be documents you haven't seen. Something in her tone made my pulse quicken. 3 days later, she called. Her voice was different, more focused. Can you come in this afternoon? I found something interesting in the property records. I canceled classes and drove over, mind racing. The receptionist led me straight back. Attorney Walsh had several thick folders on her desk and gestured for me to sit. Jenna, when did your father refinance the house? She asked. I stared blankly. I don't think he did. Attorney Walsh turned her computer screen toward me. County records showed a refinancing date from 2 years ago with 2 names on the new deed, mine and Dad's. You own 50% of that house. You've been a legal co-owner for 2 years. My hands went numb. I read my name over and over on the screen. But I never signed anything like that, I whispered. Attorney Walsh pulled out another document. Remember that day he asked you to meet him at the bank for medical directives? The memory flooded back. Dad nervous, talking about proper documentation. I'd signed multiple papers, trusting completely. Your father was protecting you, Attorney Walsh continued. By making you co-owner, he ensured you couldn't be forced out. The will your brother claims to have? It only covers your father's 50%. You already own the other half. The room spun. Everything David had said was wrong. Everything I'd believed about my place in the family was wrong. There's more. Attorney Walsh opened another folder filled with Dad's careful handwriting. Dates, amounts, purposes, years of entries documenting every payment I'd made. He was building a case for you, protecting you legally in ways you didn't even know. I felt tears coming, not from sadness but from something deeper. Dad had seen me. He had planned for my future. The drive home was different this time. I thought about Dad at his desk, carefully recording my contributions, watching David's visits grow shorter. How he must have realized which child was truly there. I pulled into the driveway and looked at the house with new eyes. This wasn't just where I'd been staying. This was mine. This was home, in ways David could never change. I sat in my car for 10 minutes, staring at the house that was actually mine, half mine anyway. The realization felt surreal, like finding out you've been walking around with a winning lottery ticket in your pocket. Dad's careful planning, his quiet protection of me while I thought I was just helping him survive. How had I missed the signs? How had I underestimated him so completely? Inside, I walked straight to Dad's desk drawer where he kept important papers. There, in a manila envelope I'd never opened, were copies of everything Attorney Walsh had shown me. The refinancing documents, the deed transfer, even a handwritten note explaining his reasoning. Jenna has earned this house through her sacrifices. She deserves security. His words, in his careful script, made my chest tight. I called David that night. My hands trembled as I dialed, but my voice stayed steady when he answered. We need to talk about the house again, I said. He sighed dramatically. Jenna, I thought we settled this. I don't have time for... I own half of it. The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice was different. Careful. What are you talking about? He asked. I explained what Attorney Walsh had found, reading directly from the county records. David's breathing changed on the other end of the line. That's impossible. Dad would have told me if he'd done something like that. His certainty was cracking, and I could hear it. He told you about the will, but not about this. Maybe he had his reasons. I'm coming over, David said, and hung up. I paced the living room, rehearsing conversations in my head. An hour later, his car pulled into the driveway with an aggressive crunch of gravel. Through the window, I watched him sit there for a moment, probably calling someone. When he finally came to the door, Rachel wasn't with him. His face was tight with barely controlled anger. "Show me," he demanded, not bothering with hello. I spread the documents across the kitchen table, the same table where I'd paid his bills for 3 years. David studied each paper like he could make the words change through sheer force of will. His jaw worked as he read. This doesn't make sense. Dad was sharp until the end. Why would he do this without discussing it with family? Maybe because I was family, I said quietly. Maybe because I was here. David's head snapped up, eyes flashing. Don't start with that guilt trip. I had responsibilities, a job, kids to support. I couldn't just drop everything like you did. The accusation hung between us, like I'd had nothing to sacrifice, like my life had been meaningless enough to abandon. I didn't drop everything, I said. I rearranged everything. There's a difference. David stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. He walked to the window, hands on his hips. This complicates things significantly. The estate planning, the taxes, everything. His mind was already working on solutions, ways to make this problem disappear, ways to make me disappear. It doesn't have to be complicated, I said. I'm not trying to take anything from you. I just want to stay here. Keep paying the mortgage on my half. Keep things the way they are. David turned around slowly. That's not how shared ownership works, Jenna. We'd both be liable for maintenance, taxes, insurance. What happens when you can't afford your share? What happens when I want to sell? The question hit me like a physical blow. I hadn't thought about the practicalities, only the emotional relief of knowing I belonged here. I've been covering everything for 3 years, I said weakly. David nodded grimly. Teacher's salary versus my income? How long do you think that's sustainable? He was right, and we both knew it. Owning half meant nothing if I couldn't afford to keep it. There has to be a solution, I said. David sat back down, his expression shifting into something more calculating. Actually, there might be. I could buy out your half, pay you fair market value. You could use that money for a down payment somewhere else, start fresh. His tone was reasonable, almost gentle, but something about it made my stomach clench. This wasn't generosity. This was strategy. I don't want to start fresh, I said. I want to stay here. This is my home. David's patience was wearing thin. Jenna, be realistic. You're 34 years old, unmarried, no kids. Do you really want to be tied to this house for the rest of your life? Don't you want more than just maintaining Dad's memory? The words stung because part of them rang true. That night, after David left, I walked through every room trying to imagine selling. The kitchen where Dad and I had shared morning coffee for 3 years. The living room where we'd watched Cubs games, where he'd told me stories about Mom. My bedroom, which had been my childhood room, then my temporary room, and now felt like the only place I truly belonged. I called Lisa again. He's not wrong about the financial complications, she said when I explained David's buyout offer. Shared ownership can be messy, especially when one person has significantly more income, but that doesn't mean you have to sell if you don't want to. She paused. Have you considered what you actually want? Not just what you're afraid of losing? The question kept me awake that night. What did I want? To stay in this house forever? Slowly going broke trying to maintain it alone? To take David's money and start over somewhere unfamiliar? I'd spent 3 years focused on what Dad needed, then weeks focused on what David wanted. I couldn't remember the last time I'd considered what I wanted for myself. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Mrs. Henderson from next door knocked just as I was finishing my coffee. I hope you don't mind me stopping by, she said. I wanted to apologize for the awkwardness at the funeral. Your brother seemed upset. Her gentle concern made my eyes water. Here was someone who'd watched me care for Dad, who'd seen my daily sacrifices. "Actually, could I ask you something?" I said. "Did my dad ever mention anything about the house? About his plans for it?" Mrs. Henderson smiled softly. "Oh, honey, he talked about it constantly. How proud he was that you'd given up your apartment to help him. How he wanted to make sure you'd always have a place to call home." She patted my hand. "He said you were the only one who really understood family." Her words hit me harder than any legal document. Dad had been proud of me, had wanted me to have security, but he'd also wanted me to have choice. The deed transfer wasn't a trap. It was a gift. A foundation to build on, not a chain to bind me. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something other than confusion and hurt. I felt possibility. That afternoon, I called Attorney Walsh. "I want to understand all my options," I said. "Not just buying or selling, but everything." She was quiet for a moment. "There are creative solutions if you're willing to consider them. Rent-to-own arrangements, property management options, even bringing in a third-party investor. The key is figuring out what outcome you want, then working backward." Her words sparked something. A plan began forming. I spent the evening researching property values, rental markets, mortgage rates. Numbers I'd never bothered learning before suddenly seemed crucial. The house was worth more than I'd realized, and my half represented substantial equity. But more than that, the location was perfect for rental income. Graduate students from the nearby university were always looking for housing. Dad's gift wasn't just sentiment, it was opportunity. When I called David the next day, my voice was steady. "I've been thinking about your offer," I said. "But I have a counteroffer." I could hear him settling in for negotiation. "I want to buy out your half instead." The silence was longer this time, and when he spoke, there was surprise mixed with irritation. "With what money? And why would I agree to that?" For the first time in weeks, I smiled. "I've been doing research," I told David, hearing his sharp intake of breath. "The house is worth more than either of us thought, and I've found financing options you probably haven't considered." I'd spent hours online, learning about portfolio loans and owner-occupied investment properties. "I can get a loan against my half to buy yours. Clean break." David's laugh was bitter. "Jenna, you teach high school. Banks aren't going to give you that kind of money." "Actually, they might," I said, surprising myself with how confident I sounded. "I've got 3 years of documented payments, excellent credit, and the property as collateral. Plus rental income potential from the basement apartment." That basement had been Dad's workshop, but it had its own entrance and bathroom. Convert it properly, and it could cover most of my mortgage payment. "I've already talked to 2 lenders." David was quiet for so long, I thought he'd hung up again. "This is insane," he finally said. "You're talking about taking on massive debt to buy me out of a house you could never afford alone. What happens when the furnace breaks? When the roof needs replacement?" His concerns were valid, which made them sting more. But I'd thought about those things too. "What happens now when those things break?" I countered. "I fix them, like I have been. The difference is I won't be wondering if someone's going to pull the rug out from under me." My voice grew stronger. "David, you don't want this house. You've made that clear. You want the cash value. I'm offering to give you that." The truth of it hung between us. "It's not about what I want," David said, but his tone had shifted. "It's about what makes financial sense. For both of us." I could hear him thinking, calculating. "Even if you could get the financing, which is a big if, what's my guarantee you won't default? I can't have my credit tied to your financial decisions." The protective brother routine was wearing thin. "I'm proposing a clean sale," I said. "Once the transaction closes, my mortgage, my responsibility, no ongoing connection between us." The words hurt to say, but they were necessary. "You get your inheritance money. I get the security Dad wanted me to have. Everyone wins." Except we both knew it meant something more permanent than just financial separation. David asked for time to think, which meant time to call Rachel and probably his financial advisor. I used the time to call Attorney Walsh and explain my plan. "It's ambitious," she said, "but not impossible." The biggest hurdle will be the appraisal and loan approval. Are you prepared for the possibility that this doesn't work? I realized I'd already moved past that possibility in my mind. The next few days felt like limbo. I went through my teaching routine, but my mind was constantly calculating numbers, imagining conversations with loan officers, picturing myself truly alone in the house, not temporarily caring for Dad, not sharing space with David's expectations, but actually owning my own life. The idea was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. Lisa came over that weekend to help me measure the basement and research renovation costs. "You know this is crazy, right?" she said as we stood in Dad's old workshop. "6 months ago, you were just helping your dad with bills." I looked around the space, imagining walls, a kitchenette, someone else's home within my home. 6 months ago, I didn't know who I was outside of taking care of other people. The first bank appointment went better than expected. The loan officer, a woman about my age named Patricia, listened carefully as I explained the situation. She reviewed my financial history, employment record, and the property details. "It's unconventional," she said, "but your payment history is excellent, and the property has strong rental potential. Let me run some numbers." Her expression was encouraging. 2 days later, David called back. "I'll consider it," he said. "But I want an independent appraisal, and I want fair market value, not some family discount." His tone was all business now. "If you can't get the financing, we go back to my original plan." I agreed, knowing this was probably my only chance. Fair was all I'd ever wanted from him anyway. The appraisal appointment felt like a test I hadn't studied for. The appraiser, a soft-spoken man named Jim, spent 2 hours measuring, photographing, and taking notes. He asked about recent improvements, which made me realize how much work I'd actually done over the past 3 years. New paint, updated fixtures, garden maintenance. I'd been improving the property without even realizing it. "You've taken good care of this place," Jim said as he finished. "Properties maintained by owners who actually live in them always show better." His comment made me think about David's house 2 states away, probably maintained by a service company. This house knew the difference between being lived in and being managed. It knew the difference between care and duty. The appraisal came back higher than either David or I had expected. The housing market had improved, and my improvements had added value. More importantly, the rental potential analysis supported my loan application. Patricia called with preliminary approval, pending final paperwork and inspection. I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, about to either fly or fall. David's reaction to the numbers was complicated. I could hear the conflict in his voice when he called. "I didn't realize the property had appreciated that much," he said. "Are you sure you want to take on this level of debt?" For a moment, he almost sounded like the protective older brother I remembered from childhood, almost like he cared about my well-being more than the transaction. "I'm sure," I said, and meant it. "David, this isn't about the money for me. This is about having a place in the world that nobody can take away." He was quiet. "I know you think I'm making a mistake, and maybe I am, but it's my mistake to make." That seemed to settle something for him. Maybe he finally understood this wasn't about him anymore. The paperwork process felt endless. Bank forms, title searches, inspection reports, insurance documents. Attorney Walsh guided me through each step, but the responsibility was mine. Each signature felt significant, like I was writing myself into existence as someone capable of major decisions. Someone who owned things, planned for the future, took calculated risks instead of just reacting to other people's choices. The home inspection revealed some issues. An aging water heater, some electrical work needed in the basement for rental conversion, but nothing that derailed the loan. I negotiated repair credits with David, another surreal conversation where we discussed the practical details of dissolving our shared ownership. Every decision brought us closer to complete separation. 3 weeks later, I sat in Attorney Walsh's conference room across from David and his lawyer, signing papers that would make me the sole owner of our childhood home. David's signature was quick, efficient, like he was closing a business deal. Mine was slower, more deliberate. I was buying more than his half of the house. I was buying my independence from his judgment. The transaction closed on a Thursday afternoon in March. David and I stood outside the attorney's office, holding copies of the same documents that meant completely different things to us. He had a check for more money than I'd ever imagined having. I had a mortgage payment that would stretch my budget for the next 30 years. Neither of us seemed to know what to say. "I hope this works out for you," David said finally. His tone was neutral, but I thought I heard something softer underneath. "I hope you don't regret this." I looked at him, really looked at him, and saw someone who'd never understood that some things mattered more than financial security. "I hope you figure out what home means to you," I replied. We hugged awkwardly, the first physical contact we'd had since the funeral. He felt like a stranger, which was both sad and liberating. "Take care of yourself," he said, getting into his car. I watched him drive away, knowing it would probably be months or years before we spoke again. The weight of that loss was real, but it felt necessary. I drove home slowly, taking the long way through neighborhoods I'd known my whole life, past my elementary school, past the park where Dad used to take us on Sundays, past the grocery store where I'd shopped for him during his final months. The geography of my life, all within a few miles of the house that was now entirely mine. The house felt different when I walked in, even though nothing had physically changed. The silence was deeper somehow, but not lonely. It was peaceful. I walked through each room, seeing them not as spaces I was temporarily occupying or caretaking, but as my spaces to fill however I chose. The responsibility was overwhelming and wonderful. That night, I called my parents' old friends to tell them about the arrangement. Most were supportive, saying Dad would have been proud. Mrs. Henderson cried a little. "He worried so much about what would happen to you," she said. "He'd be so happy knowing you found a way to stay." Her words made me realize Dad's gift hadn't been the house itself, but the foundation to build my own life. I spent the evening making plans for the basement apartment, sketching layouts and calculating costs. The renovation would take time and money I wasn't sure I had, but it felt like building rather than just maintaining. For the first time since Dad's diagnosis, I was creating something new instead of just preserving something old. As I fell asleep that night, I thought about the strange journey from funeral to ownership, from David's insults to independence. 6 months ago, I'd been someone who happened to live in her father's house. Now I was someone who'd fought for her home and won. The transformation felt bigger than property ownership. It felt like finally becoming myself. The house settled around me with familiar creaks and sighs, sounds that used to remind me of Dad, but now sounded like welcome home. Tomorrow would bring contractor estimates and permit applications and all the practical details of my new reality. But tonight, I was simply and completely where I belonged, in the home I'd earned through love and sacrifice, and finally, courage. 3 months into renovations, I stood in what used to be Dad's workshop, surrounded by drywall dust and the smell of fresh paint. The transformation was happening slowly, more slowly than I'd budgeted for, both financially and emotionally. Every wall I tore down felt like erasing another piece of Dad's presence. Every new fixture I installed felt like claiming the space as my own. The contractor, Miguel, had been patient with my indecision. "You sure about the kitchen layout?" Miguel asked, holding up the cabinet plans for the 3rd time this week. I stared at the drawings, imagining someone else cooking breakfast where Dad used to sand furniture. "It's not about the kitchen," I admitted. "It's about letting go of the way things were." Miguel nodded like he understood. "My grandmother's house," he said, "took me 2 years to paint over her wallpaper." The first potential tenant came by on a rainy Tuesday in June. Sarah was a graduate student in environmental science, soft-spoken and careful about wiping her feet. She loved the separate entrance, the quiet neighborhood, the built-in bookshelves Miguel had suggested. "It feels peaceful," she said, running her hand along the wood trim Dad had installed decades ago. I realized I'd been holding my breath, waiting for someone to appreciate what we'd built here. But Sarah's application was rejected when her advisor couldn't guarantee her funding beyond the fall semester. The second applicant wanted to paint the walls black and install a hot tub where Dad's workbench used to be. The third never showed up for our appointment. Each rejection felt personal, like my judgment was being questioned. Maybe David had been right about my financial naivety. During this same period, my relationships at school were shifting in unexpected ways. My department head, Mrs. Chen, pulled me aside after a faculty meeting. "You seem different this year," she said. "More decisive. Have you considered applying for the curriculum coordinator position? The job would mean more responsibility, more money, and recognition I'd never sought before." "I hadn't thought about it," I said, which was true. But I did think about it that night, sitting in my newly refinished living room. For 3 years, I'd been in survival mode, just keeping everything functioning. Now I had space to consider what I wanted professionally. The coordinator position would mean developing new programs, mentoring younger teachers, actually using my master's degree in ways I'd forgotten were possible. It would also mean income that could better support my mortgage. The application process forced me to articulate my teaching philosophy, my vision for education, things I'd stopped thinking about during Dad's illness. Writing the essays, I rediscovered parts of myself that had been dormant. The woman who'd graduated summa cum laude, who'd won teaching awards early in her career, who'd had ambitions beyond just getting by. That woman had been buried under years of caregiving, but she wasn't gone. My interview went better than expected. I talked passionately about project-based learning, about connecting curriculum to real-world problems, about helping students find their own voices. The committee seemed surprised by my enthusiasm, like they'd expected the quiet, dependable teacher who never caused waves. "We'll be in touch soon," Mrs. Chen said, but her smile suggested the decision was already made. Meanwhile, I found a new potential tenant through completely unexpected means. I was at the farmer's market, buying tomatoes from the same vendor Dad and I used to visit, when the woman behind me in line commented on my canvas bag. "I love that quote," she said, pointing to the Thoreau print. "I'm actually looking for a place that feels that peaceful." Her name was Elena. She taught yoga, and she believed in maintaining spaces with intention. Elena's application was perfect. Steady income from her studio, excellent references, and a security deposit ready immediately. But more than that, she understood the energy of the house. "This place has been loved," she said during her second visit. "I can feel it in the woodwork, the way the light falls. I'd be honored to be part of its story." I signed the lease that afternoon. Having Elena move in shifted the entire dynamic of the house. She was quiet but present, her morning yoga practice creating gentle sounds that reminded me I wasn't alone. She tended a small herb garden in the backyard, bringing fresh mint for tea and asking permission before planting anything new. Her rent covered most of my mortgage, and her presence made the house feel alive again. The curriculum coordinator position came through in August, with a salary increase that finally made my financial situation comfortable rather than precarious. My first project was redesigning the senior English curriculum, something I approached with energy I hadn't felt in years. Students responded to my renewed enthusiasm, and colleagues began seeking my input on their own projects. Recognition felt foreign but wonderful. One evening in early September, I was grading papers on the front porch when my neighbor Tom walked by with his dog. We'd exchanged pleasantries for years, but he stopped this time. "The house looks great," he said. "Your dad would be proud of what you've done with it." Tom was recently divorced, kind eyes, worked as a physical therapist. We talked for 20 minutes about nothing important, and it felt like the first real conversation I'd had with a man in years. Tom started finding excuses to walk past more often, sometimes stopping to chat, sometimes just waving. When he offered to help me winterize the garden, I accepted. We worked quietly together, mulching flower beds and trimming bushes, comfortable in a way that surprised me. "I always admired how you took care of your father," he said as we finished. Not everyone would have done that. His respect meant more than romantic interest. But romantic interest was there too, subtle and patient. Tom asked if I'd like to go to the art fair downtown, just as friends, no pressure. I said yes before I could overthink it. Our first date was gentle, walking through booths and sharing kettle corn, talking about books and travel and dreams we'd put on hold. I told him about the house purchase, the renovation, the sense of finally building my own life. "You're brave," Tom said as we watched a street musician play guitar. "Starting over takes courage." I wanted to correct him, to explain that I hadn't started over, just finally started being myself. But maybe those were the same thing. Maybe courage was just allowing yourself to become who you'd always been, underneath all the roles and responsibilities and other people's expectations. The autumn brought small pleasures I'd forgotten to notice during Dad's illness. Elena and I developed a friendship based on shared morning coffee and gardening advice. My students were responding to curriculum changes with excitement rather than resistance. Tom and I settled into a comfortable dating rhythm, dinners and movies and long conversations that made me remember why I enjoyed male companionship. But the biggest change was internal. I stopped expecting disaster around every corner, stopped calculating how much sacrifice each decision would require. When the washing machine broke, I called a repair service instead of panic budgeting for a replacement. When Elena asked about extending her lease, I said yes, without checking my bank balance first. Financial security felt like breathing after years of holding my breath. David called in October, the first time since the house transaction closed. "I heard about your promotion," he said. "Congratulations." His tone was neutral, but calling at all felt significant. We talked carefully for 10 minutes about work and weather, avoiding anything personal. "The house looks good from the street," he said before hanging up. "You were right about being able to handle it." Close to an apology, as I'd probably get. That phone call stirred up emotions I thought I'd resolved. Not regret about the house, but sadness about the relationship we'd lost. David and I had been close as children, before his success and my choices created different expectations for our lives. Maybe someday we'd find a way back to being siblings instead of adversaries. But for now, his acknowledgement was enough. Halloween brought my first experience as the neighborhood house that gives out good candy. Kids in costumes rang the doorbell. Parents I recognized from years of Dad's stories. "Miss Matthews!" Several of my former students called out, surprised to see me in a residential context. Elena helped me distribute treats, and Tom stopped by with his nephew. The house felt like part of the community in ways it hadn't when I was just Dad's caretaker. November brought colder weather and my first winter as sole homeowner. The heating bills would be entirely my responsibility. The snow removal, the inevitable maintenance issues that came with an older house. But I found myself looking forward to it. This winter, I wasn't managing someone else's property or worried about temporary arrangements. This winter, I was home. Elena knocked on my door one snowy evening with homemade soup and a question. "Would you be interested in hosting a small book club?" she asked. "I know several women who'd love a cozy place to meet monthly." I thought about the living room where Dad and I had watched television in comfortable silence, now ready for new conversations and different kinds of community. The first book club meeting happened in December. 6 women sitting around my coffee table, discussing a novel about starting over after loss. The conversation was rich and personal, touching on themes that felt relevant to my own journey. Afterward, as I cleaned up wine glasses and cookie crumbs, I realized this was what Dad had wanted for me. Not just security, but a full life. Tom asked me to spend New Year's Eve with him, and I said yes without hesitation. We watched fireworks from his balcony, talking about hopes for the coming year. "I want to travel more," I said. "See places I've only read about in books." The desire surprised me with its intensity. For the first time in years, I was thinking beyond just maintaining what I had. I was planning adventures. As we kissed at midnight, I thought about the journey from Dad's funeral to this moment. 11 months ago, I'd been someone who defined herself through service to others. Someone who believed her own dreams were selfish luxuries. Tonight, I was someone who owned her own home, excelled in her career, built community, and opened her heart to possibility. The house settled around us as the new year began, solid and welcoming and thoroughly mine. All the decisions I'd made, fighting David, buying him out, renovating the basement, taking career risks, had led to this moment of complete belonging. Not just to a place, but to my own life. Dad's gift hadn't been the house itself, but the courage to claim what was rightfully mine. Walking home that night, I looked up at the bedroom windows, glowing warmly against the winter sky. Inside, Elena was probably reading before sleep, and I would soon be planning lessons for enthusiastic students. And tomorrow would bring all the ordinary pleasures of a life I'd built through my own choices. The house wasn't just shelter anymore. It was proof that I could trust myself to create the life I wanted. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came decisions I'd never imagined myself confident enough to make. The school district offered me a chance to present my curriculum innovations at a state education conference. 2 years ago, I would have declined, convinced I had nothing valuable to share. Now I accepted immediately, excited to discuss project-based learning with teachers from across the region. Recognition felt natural rather than surprising. Tom and I had been dating for 8 months when he brought up the subject of his lease renewal. "My landlord's selling," he said over dinner at our favorite restaurant. "I need to find a new place by July." He wasn't asking directly, but the question hung between us. We'd been spending most nights together anyway, alternating between his apartment and my house. The logical solution was obvious, but it still felt enormous. "What would that look like?" I asked carefully. We'd talked about future plans in general terms, but never specific arrangements. Tom understood my need for independence, how hard I'd fought for the security of my own space. "I'd pay half the mortgage and utilities," he said. "Keep my own bank account, contribute to household decisions, respect that it's your house first." His thoughtfulness touched me more than romantic gestures ever had. We decided to try a trial period over the summer when school was out. Tom moved his furniture into storage and brought only essentials: clothes, books, his grandmother's piano that fit perfectly in the front room. Elena was delighted, joking that she'd have built-in music for her yoga practice. The house absorbed his presence easily, like it had been waiting for this particular configuration of people and purpose. The adjustment period was smoother than either of us expected. Tom respected my morning routine, contributed to household maintenance without taking over, and brought skills I lacked. When the kitchen faucet started leaking, he fixed it himself instead of calling a service. When I mentioned wanting a vegetable garden, he researched soil composition and drainage patterns. We complemented each other's strengths rather than competing. My presentation at the education conference went better than I'd dared hope. Teachers crowded around afterward with questions about implementation strategies and assessment methods. 3 districts requested follow-up consultations, and 1 university asked me to guest lecture in their teacher preparation program. Dr. Patricia Williams from the State Education Department handed me her business card. "We should talk about curriculum development opportunities," she said. Possibilities I'd never considered suddenly seemed attainable. Elena's lease came up for renewal in June, and our conversation about continuing felt more like family planning than business negotiation. "This place has become my sanctuary," she said as we shared morning coffee in the garden. "But I also want to make sure you have space for your life to grow." I assured her that her presence enhanced rather than limited my choices. Having her there made Tom's transition easier and the house feel complete. The book club had evolved into something deeper than literary discussion. 6 women meeting monthly to share stories, support each other's challenges, celebrate successes. When Margaret's husband was diagnosed with early-stage cancer, we rallied around her with meals and rides to appointments. When Jessica's daughter graduated college, we threw a garden party that lasted until midnight. Community had grown organically from Elena's simple suggestion. July brought an unexpected visitor. David called to say he'd be in town for a work conference and asked if he could stop by the house. I agreed nervously, unsure what to expect after almost a year of minimal contact. When he arrived, Rachel and the kids were with him. Seeing my nephews, taller and more confident than I remembered, reminded me how much time had passed since we'd all been together. David walked through the house slowly, noting changes I'd made, improvements that had nothing to do with the basement apartment. New hardwood floors, updated bathroom fixtures, the piano in the front room. "It looks good," he said finally. "It looks like you." The compliment felt genuine rather than grudging. Rachel commented on how peaceful the space felt, how clearly it was loved rather than just maintained. "I owe you an apology." David said as we sat on the front porch while the kids played in the backyard. I was scared about Dad's death, about the responsibilities, about making the right decisions. I took that fear out on you instead of recognizing what you'd already sacrificed. His words didn't erase the hurt from the funeral, but they acknowledged it. You proved me wrong about a lot of things. We talked for 2 hours, carefully at first, then with increasing warmth. David told me about struggles with his teenage son, work pressures he'd never admitted to before. I shared stories about my students, the conference presentation, Tom. We found common ground in ways that felt familiar and new. Not the siblings we'd been as children, but adults who could respect each other's choices. When they left, David hugged me longer than he had since we were teenagers. "Don't be a stranger," he said. "The kids should know their aunt better." Rachel invited me to visit them for Christmas, an invitation I surprised myself by accepting. Healing wasn't dramatic reconciliation, just willingness to build something new from what remained of our connection. Tom proposed on a Thursday evening in September, not with grand gestures, but with honest conversation about the life we wanted to build together. We were sitting on the back deck, watching Elena tend her herb garden, planning winter repairs. "I love the life we're creating here," he said. "I want to make it permanent, legally and emotionally." His proposal included practical details, shared mortgage responsibility, estate planning, combining resources for home improvements. The wedding planning process revealed how much my priorities had shifted. Instead of elaborate ceremonies, I wanted celebration in the backyard where Dad used to grill hamburgers, where Elena had planted lavender, where Tom had built raised garden beds. Simple food, close friends, meaningful vows. Mrs. Henderson offered to officiate, having gotten ordained online specifically for neighborhood ceremonies. Everything felt organic, authentic. We married in October, surrounded by the book club women, my teaching colleagues, Elena's yoga students, and both our families. David walked me down the makeshift aisle, his presence representing possibility for repaired relationships. Tom's vows included promises to honor the home we'd built together and support my professional dreams. My vows promised partnership without losing the independence I'd fought to claim. The reception lasted until sunset, neighbors wandering over to join the celebration, my students surprising me with a video message about how my teaching had inspired their own goals. Elena played guitar while Tom accompanied on piano, improvising songs that made everyone laugh. The house felt completely alive, filled with every kind of love that mattered: romantic, familial, community-based, personal achievement. Dr. Williams from the State Department called the week after the wedding with a job offer I hadn't expected. Curriculum specialist position, working with districts statewide to implement innovative programs. The salary increase would make our mortgage payments comfortable, and the travel would satisfy my newfound desire for adventure. Tom encouraged me to accept, confident in our ability to navigate changes together. My last day as full-time classroom teacher was bittersweet, but my students threw a party that reminded me why I'd chosen education originally. "You taught us to believe in ourselves," one senior said in a speech that made me cry. "Now you're showing us what that looks like in real life." Their recognition of my growth felt like the deepest validation possible. Elena decided to buy a house of her own that winter, ready for more space and a bigger garden. Her departure was sad but celebratory. She'd saved enough for a down payment during her time with us, and we'd helped each other through transitions that changed our lives completely. We threw her a going-away party in the basement apartment she'd made beautiful, promising to stay close. As I write this, it's been 2 years since Dad's funeral, 18 months since I bought David out, 1 year since Tom moved in permanently. Tomorrow I start my new position with the state, traveling to districts that want to transform their educational approaches. Tonight, Tom and I are planning the renovation of Elena's former apartment into a home office and guest suite for visiting family. The house has taught me that home isn't just about belonging to a place, but about creating space for the people and dreams that matter most. Dad's gift wasn't really the property itself, but the foundation to build a life based on my own values rather than other people's expectations. Every room holds evidence of choices I made deliberately, courageously, successfully. Sometimes I stand in the kitchen where Dad and I shared morning coffee, where Tom now makes his grandmother's pancake recipe, where book club friends gather for impromptu dinners. The continuity between past and present feels seamless rather than stuck. Memory and possibility coexist in ways that honor what was while embracing what's becoming.